Whoa!
The dawn of humanity has always been shrouded in mystery. Who was the very first human? Where did he walk? What did he see when he opened his eyes to a world untouched by civilization? Was he a lonely wanderer, or part of a tribe long lost to time? For millennia, ancient myths tried to answer this riddle. The Sumerians believed the gods shaped man from clay and divine breath. In Egypt, Atum was said to create humanity from his own essence. The Greeks spoke of Prometheus stealing fire and life from the heavens, while the Mayans told of beings molded from maize. Every culture across every continent imagined a beginning, and each believed theirs was true. But modern science paints an equally astonishing story. According to paleoanthropologists, Homo sapiens emerged nearly 300,000 years ago in Africa. The oldest remains discovered in Jebel Irhoud, Morocco, belong to a people remarkably like us, yet profoundly different. Their skulls were slightly elongated, their jaws stronger, their faces broader, and yet their eyes, filled with the same hunger, fear, and curiosity, were unmistakably human. Imagine their world, a vast, untamed planet unscarred by cities, roads, or empires. Towering savannas stretched under burning suns, herds of ancient antelope roamed freely, while giant predators, saber-toothed cats, hyenas, and towering lions ruled the night. Rivers carved deep valleys through endless forests, and the air carried the wild symphony of insects, birds, and distant thunder. To survive here was to read nature like a living map. Every rustle, every shadow, every smell mattered. The earliest humans lived in small bands, bound by fragile trust and necessity. They hunted with sharp-edged stones, scavenged from predators' kills, and discovered the secret of fire, a spark that turned darkness into safety, cold into warmth, and fear into ritual. Around flickering flames they shared stories, created symbols on cave walls, and passed down knowledge that would shape the future of all humanity. Yet the deeper we dig into the past, the stranger the story becomes. Mysterious footprints preserved in volcanic ash in Tanzania suggest early humans walked upright far earlier than once believed. Ancient tools, found buried beneath layers of earth, hint at lost populations we know almost nothing about. Every discovery reshapes history and reminds us that the first man is both real and mythic, science and legend intertwined. Somewhere, deep in the layers of forgotten time, the echoes of his footsteps still remain, waiting to be uncovered. For the earliest humans, every single day was a battle between life and death. There were no walls to protect them, no kingdoms to shelter them, no written knowledge to guide them. The earth itself was both a cradle and a predator, nurturing them with food yet constantly threatening to take it away. Imagine the endless plains of prehistoric Africa, stretching into the horizon beneath an unforgiving sun. Small groups of men and women moved silently through tall grass, their bodies lean and tense, eyes sharp with instinct. Every rustle could mean prey or predator. They hunted together, not with bows or spears of steel, but with sharpened stones and wooden sticks hardened by fire. To bring down even a single antelope meant survival for days. To fail meant hunger, weakness, and death. At night, the world transformed. Darkness belonged to others, creatures faster, stronger, and deadlier than any human. Packs of hyenas prowled the shadows, and lions' roars rolled like thunder across the plains. Without fire, early humans were vulnerable. But then came the greatest discovery in human history, the control of flame. Fire was more than warmth, it was safety, it was community. Around the fire, the first humans became storytellers. They used flickering shadows to explain the world, weaving myths of spirits, gods, and forces beyond comprehension. Flames turned caves into sanctuaries, and caves became the first classrooms where wisdom passed from one generation to the next. These gatherings forged the beginnings of culture. Early humans learned to share, to protect one another, to mourn the dead and celebrate the living. Primitive tools evolved into better weapons. Animal skins became clothing, and strange pigments were mixed to paint the walls of caves with images of hunts and dreams. In these silent murals, we glimpse the birth of human imagination, and perhaps the first signs of something greater than survival: identity. But nature never gave them peace for long. Harsh droughts forced migrations across rivers and mountains. Ice ages reshaped the land, driving humans into caves and forcing them to adapt or perish. Rival tribes fought over fertile valleys and hunting grounds, leaving behind cracked skulls and broken spears buried in ancient soil. Through all this, one truth remained: they endured. Against impossible odds, humanity not only survived, but spread, carrying fire, language, and memory to every corner of the earth. And somewhere in those migrations, among the whispering winds and wild forests, the foundations of civilization were quietly being laid. By the time our ancestors left Africa, they thought they were alone. The chosen, the hunters, the survivors. But as they moved across strange new lands, they discovered a chilling truth. They were not the only humans walking the earth. In the deep valleys of Europe, beneath snow-capped mountains and ancient forests, they encountered a people unlike themselves. Stockier, stronger, their faces broad and shadowed beneath heavy brows. These were the Neanderthals. For hundreds of thousands of years, they had ruled the cold lands of the north, masters of stone and fire. To our ancestors, they were both kin and rivals. At first, fear defined their meetings. Two tribes, two worlds colliding, watching each other through the smoke of distant fires. There were no words to bridge the silence, only sharp instincts and the understanding that resources were scarce. Sometimes these encounters ended in violence: broken spears, scattered bones, and blood on the frozen earth. And yet, something unexpected happened. Not all meetings were battles. In quiet valleys, under starlit skies, some humans and Neanderthals shared food, shelter, and eventually, bloodlines. Love, or perhaps survival, bound them together, and their children carried fragments of both worlds. To this day, pieces of Neanderthal DNA live on in almost every person outside Africa, a silent memory of ancient unions and forgotten tribes. But Neanderthals were not the only ones. Farther east, across wild rivers and windswept plains, another mysterious people emerged: the Denisovans. Almost nothing remains of them but fragments of bone and teeth, yet their genetic whispers tell us a story. Our ancestors met them too, and their legacy still flows in the veins of millions. These encounters reshaped humanity. Each new meeting brought knowledge: better tools, stronger shelters, new ways to survive. But they also brought danger. Rival tribes clashed over fertile hunting grounds. Storms, famines, and predators forced migrations deeper into unknown lands. Every decision carved humanity's path forward, pushing our species to adapt faster, think sharper, and dream bigger. By the time the last Neanderthals vanished, swallowed by time and change, we had inherited a strange world. One built not by us alone, but by many. Every spark of fire, every song, every myth carried fragments of those we once called others. And in this merging of blood and memory, the first threads of our shared human story were woven. Firelight flickered against the cave walls, painting strange shadows that seemed alive. Our ancestors huddled close, listening to the roar of the wind outside, the cries of unseen beasts in the dark. The world beyond the fire was vast and dangerous, and for the first time, humanity began to ask the questions that would shape its destiny. Why are we here? What lies beyond the mountains? Why do the stars watch us at night? Without answers, they created their own. Fear gave birth to gods. When lightning split the sky, it was the voice of a mighty spirit. When the river flooded, it was the anger of an unseen force. Death was no longer an ending. It became a passage, a return, or a punishment. In whispered chants and secret symbols, the first stories of creation and destruction were born. Small groups of humans began to gather around sacred places, caves where the earth breathed, rivers that glimmered beneath the moon, trees older than memory. These became the first temples, though they had no walls, no marble, no statues. The world itself was the altar. And then came the rituals. They painted animal hunts on stone, believing the drawings gave them power. They placed flowers on graves, hoping to guide the spirits of the dead. Around the fire, shamans told tales of ancestors who walked with gods, and people believed, because belief gave them courage. But rituals were not just prayers. They were power. Those who claimed to speak to the unseen began to lead tribes, shaping decisions, guiding migrations, even declaring wars. Myths became laws, and faith bound strangers into families. And across different lands, far from one another, humanity dreamed of the divine in remarkably similar ways. In the plains of Africa, the forests of Europe, and the icy steppes of Asia, different tribes imagined gods of thunder, fertility, and death. It was as though humanity shared one collective memory, one longing for meaning beyond survival. With belief came art, music, and the first symbols of identity. People no longer just lived, they belonged. But with faith also came fear. Those outside the tribe's belief became others, and conflict followed wherever myths collided. By the end of this age, humanity was no longer merely surviving. We were storytellers, dreamers, creators of worlds unseen. And somewhere deep within the oldest myths lay the first seeds of civilization, and the first warnings of what happens when faith and power intertwine. For countless generations, humanity wandered endlessly across plains, forests, and deserts, chasing herds and following the seasons. But around 12,000 years ago, something began to change. Somewhere in the fertile valleys, along the rivers of the Near East, small groups of nomads started to stay in one place. At first, they built temporary shelters from branches, reeds, and animal hides. But seasons passed, and they didn't move on. The reason was simple. The land provided. Wild grains like einkorn and barley grew thick along the riverbanks, and humans learned to collect and store them. Hunters began to trap animals rather than chase them endlessly. Goats, sheep, and later cattle were slowly tamed and kept near campfires. What started as survival became the first spark of control over nature. Imagine an early settlement at night. Flickering firelight casts shadows on mud brick walls. Smoke rises into a star-filled sky, and families huddle close, sharing food they no longer had to chase. Children laugh as they feed a tethered goat. Dogs, once wild hunters, lie curled at the edges of the camp, guarding the people they've bonded with. For the first time in history, human lives became anchored to a single place. But this new life came with consequences. Where once there was freedom to roam, now there were boundaries to defend against predators, strangers, and even rival groups. Settlements attracted wealth. Grain stores, tools, and herds became treasures worth fighting over. Conflicts sparked where before there had been only migration. And yet, Despite danger, people stayed. Year after year, the shelters grew into permanent homes. Graves were dug beneath living spaces, turning the earth beneath into a sacred memory. Rituals began to emerge, offerings to unseen gods, carved figurines placed in corners of mud huts, the earliest signs of organized belief. This was the turning point. Humanity had begun to shape its environment, but in doing so, we were reshaped by it. Soon, what started as small camps would evolve into something unthinkable: villages, cities, and civilizations. And with this transformation came new tensions: ownership, hierarchy, and power. Some thrived, while others were left behind. The seeds of inequality, religion, and empire were being sown in the soft soil of these early homes. The next chapter of our journey would change humanity forever. By 10,000 BCE, humanity had already stepped onto a new path, one that would lead us away from the wild and into the age of control. No longer simple wanderers, small bands of early settlers began to shape the land itself. It started humbly, scattering collected seeds into loosened soil, hoping they would grow near camp instead of miles away. But over generations, through trial and failure, this fragile experiment became the foundation of agriculture. Imagine the scene. Under a rising sun, a small group of families kneel in freshly turned earth, pressing wild grains into rows with their bare hands. Primitive tools, sharpened stones tied to wooden shafts, cut furrows through soft soil. Children chase each other between tiny plots of barley and einkorn, while elders watch the horizon for signs of approaching storms. The work is grueling, but the promise of food security drives them forward. With agriculture came abundance, and for the first time, surpluses. Food could be stored, traded, or given as tribute. But abundance brought something else: division. Some guarded the grain, others labored in the fields, and slowly, hierarchies emerged. Those who controlled resources began to command authority, shaping the first whispers of power and class. This new stability gave rise to something equally transformative: belief. Under vast, star-filled skies, early settlers looked for meaning in the cycles of growth and death. Rain, sun, and soil became sacred forces. Small figurines carved from bone and stone were placed in shrines within the heart of the settlement, offerings to gods of fertility and harvest. Fires burned through the night as families gathered around elders who whispered stories of creation, spirits, and divine will. At dawn, rituals began. Women sprinkled seeds while chanting invocations, asking unseen powers for a good harvest. Men carried bowls of grain to earthen altars, leaving gifts of food, shells, or animal bones. And in these small, intimate acts, humanity was forever transformed. We had forged our first connection to the divine. But even as we prayed, danger loomed. The success of agriculture made settlements targets. Tribes that once roamed freely now clashed over land and resources. Blood was spilled on fields meant to nourish life. Walls were built, alliances formed, and war, once rare, became a shadow of our progress. Still, people did not turn back. Villages grew into proto-cities, their storage pits overflowing with grain. Sacred spaces became temples, and spiritual leaders emerged, wielding influence over both harvests and hearts. Humanity had entered an irreversible age, one where nature, faith, and power intertwined. Soon, the simple act of around 9500 BCE, on a remote plateau in what is now southeastern Turkey, something extraordinary began to rise from the earth. Hunter-gatherers, who had only recently begun to tame plants and animals, gathered here for a singular purpose: to build. Massive limestone pillars, Some weighing more than 20 tons were carved and raised into perfect circles. Strange animal reliefs, foxes, vultures, snakes, decorated their surfaces. No villages surrounded the site, no signs of daily life. This was not a home, it was a temple. The place is known today as Göbekli Tepe. Imagine the scene. Hundreds of people from distant tribes converge under a blazing sun, hauling colossal stones with ropes made of twisted reeds. Their bare feet dig into dry earth as they chant together, pushing the impossible higher with each heave. Sparks of stone tools against rock fill the air. As night falls, fires blaze around the unfinished circles, their smoke rising into the star-filled sky. Why did they do this? For the first time, humanity built, not for survival but for belief. Here, ritual replaced necessity. Gatherings were held beneath towering stone guardians. Offerings of wild gazelle meat, grains, and fermented honey were laid at altars. People danced to the rhythms of drums made from stretched animal hides, their bodies painted in red ochre, as priests invoked unseen powers. But Göbekli Tepe was only the beginning. Across the ancient world, sacred centers blossomed. In the fertile valleys of Mesopotamia, clay ziggurats began to rise, layered like stairways to the heavens. Along the Nile, early Egyptians worshipped the cycles of the river, shaping beliefs that would echo for millennia. And in Europe, mysterious stone monuments, precursors to Stonehenge, marked the turning of the seasons and the passage of souls. These monuments of faith did more than honor the divine. They united people. Shared rituals gave strangers a common identity. Temples became places of gathering, exchange, and power. Priests, once simple storytellers, grew into guardians of knowledge and authority. With belief came hierarchy, and with hierarchy came control. Food surpluses were stored beneath sacred grounds, guarded by those who claimed divine favor. Leaders emerged, tying their power to the gods, declaring themselves chosen intermediaries between heaven and earth. But such reverence had its cost. Across the land, rival cults clashed, each claiming to know the will of the divine. Sometimes blood stained the very stones meant to honor gods. Yet humanity pressed forward, unwilling or unable to abandon the call of something greater than ourselves. By 8000 BCE, humanity had crossed an invisible threshold. The great temples of Göbekli Tepe and other sacred sites had ignited something new, a hunger for permanence. For the first time, people were no longer content to wander. They began to settle, to build, to control. One of the earliest examples was Jericho. Imagine it, a cluster of mud brick houses sprawled beneath a scorching sun, each packed tightly within protective stone walls, the first fortifications in human history. Outside, golden fields of barley sway, irrigated by ingenious canals. Within the walls, life pulses. Children chase goats through narrow alleys. Women grind grain between smooth stones, and men return from hunting with deer slung over their shoulders. But the walls were more than protection. They were power. Inside Jericho's boundaries, a new social order took shape. Priests ruled from sacred towers, their chants rising at dawn as smoke from burnt offerings curled toward the sky. Beneath them, artisans carved tools, potters shaped clay, and traders exchanged obsidian, shells, and salt. Wealth flowed where control was strongest, and with wealth came jealousy. Farther east, along the fertile banks of the Euphrates, rose another marvel. Uruk, humanity's first true city. Here, by 3500 BCE, tens of thousands lived under the watchful gaze of colossal ziggurats, stepped temples that pierced the clouds. These towering monuments were more than symbols. They were machines of belief and authority. In Uruk's bustling streets, scribes pressed cuneiform signs into wet clay, recording trade, taxes, and laws. The birth of writing itself. Merchants bargained for lapis lazuli from Afghanistan, cedarwood from Lebanon, and gold from Anatolia. Markets roared with voices, the smell of roasted fish and fresh dates filling the air. For the first time, humanity experienced the chaos and energy of urban life. But city living brought new problems. With walls came conflict. Rival settlements fought for land, water, and prestige. Armies formed and blood was spilled where once there had been open fields. Disease spread quickly among crowded homes, yet people endured. Because within the city lay opportunity, protection, and the promise of immortality through monuments. In these first cities, power consolidated in the hands of a few, priests, kings, and merchants who controlled food, faith, and trade. Humanity had entered a new age, one where temples became palaces and belief became law. From this point on, there would be no turning back. The stone circles had given way to stone walls. The wandering tribes had become subjects, and civilization, with all its splendor and suffering, had begun its unstoppable march. By 3000 BCE, humanity had stepped into a new age. The scattered villages and early cities gave way to something far greater: empires. No longer was power local, it stretched across rivers, deserts, and mountains. And at the heart of this transformation stood rulers who were no longer just leaders, but living gods. In the fertile lands between the Tigris and Euphrates, the Sumerians built the first city-states. Each had its own walls, its own temple, its own god, and its own king-priest. Above the flat, shimmering plains of Mesopotamia, ziggurats rose like stone mountains, colossal stairways to the heavens. Every brick carried prayers, every shadow whispered of divine power. Life here was organized but not equal. At dawn, scribes recorded taxes on clay tablets, their reed pens scratching quietly in dim workshops. Farmers bent under the sun, tending canals and fields so the city might thrive. Soldiers guarded the gates, spears glinting in the heat. At the top of this rigid order, priest-kings ruled by decree, their authority absolute. For to disobey the king was to defy the gods. Then came Sargon of Akkad, around 2334 BCE. This man, once a cupbearer, forged the world's first true empire. He conquered the Sumerian city-states one by one, uniting them beneath his banner. In relief carvings, we see him standing tall, his soldiers kneeling before him. His name became legend, carried by merchants and poets alike. Sargon, king of the four corners of the world. Meanwhile, along the green ribbon of the Nile, another power awakened: ancient Egypt. Here, unlike anywhere else, kings were not just chosen by the gods, they were gods. Pharaohs ruled with divine authority, their words eternal law. Under their reign, vast armies of workers built colossal pyramids to pierce the skies, monuments designed to outlast time itself. In the markets of Thebes and Memphis, gold, incense, and lapis lazuli changed hands beneath painted awnings. Priests performed endless rituals to maintain Ma'at, the cosmic balance, while peasants prayed for good floods. Artisans carved hieroglyphs into smooth limestone, immortalizing the deeds of pharaohs and gods alike. But this new era came at a cost. To hold empires together, rulers demanded loyalty, taxes, and labor. Wars were constant, rebellions inevitable. Yet despite the bloodshed, the age of empires brought extraordinary advancements. Writing, mathematics, astronomy, law, the very foundations of civilization. By the end of this chapter in history, humanity had learned a dangerous truth. When kings become gods, empires rise, but their fall is always waiting. For centuries, the first empires stood as if eternal. Their kings carved into stone, their names written into the heavens. But history whispers a cruel truth. No empire lasts forever. By 2200 BCE, the skies above Mesopotamia darkened. Records carved on ancient tablets tell of droughts so severe that rivers shrank to dust. The lifeblood of the Sumerian cities, their irrigation canals, dried into cracked earth. Fields turned barren, grain withered, and famine stalked the land. Desperate citizens abandoned their temples, leaving ziggurats to crumble under desert winds. Then came invasion. From the northern mountains rode the Gutians, fierce nomadic tribes who swept through the weakened Sumerian city-states like a sandstorm. The mighty temples were plundered, and ancient libraries burned. The great kings, once believed divine, fell silent as their empires fractured into ruin. But Mesopotamia was not alone. Farther west, in the lush valley of the Nile, Egypt's golden age faltered. After the construction of the last pyramids, the old kingdom slid into chaos. Floods failed, harvests collapsed, and famine spread like a shadow. The divine pharaohs, once worshipped as living gods, faced rebellion from their own people. Civil war erupted. Rival kings carved the land into pieces. Meanwhile, in the east, the Indus Valley civilization, with its grand cities of Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa, mysteriously vanished. Archaeologists uncover streets once alive with traders and artisans, now frozen in silence. Some blame shifting rivers. Others point to climate collapse or disease. Whatever the cause, a great civilization dissolved, leaving behind only ghost cities beneath the sand. The fall of these empires left scars that lasted centuries. Knowledge was lost, libraries destroyed, rituals forgotten, innovations buried beneath rubble. And yet, from the ruins, something new always rose. Survivors adapted, rebuilt, and dreamed again. History's greatest lesson is carved into the stones of these ancient cities. Even gods can fall, but humanity always endures.